We'll begin. Welcome back, everyone. Our next discussion is the IAG's presentation to the board on cyber risk on external audits. Please welcome IAG member Nemat Shroff, who will lead the discussion regarding cyber risk and external audits, with Brian Levine, Managing Director, Cybersecurity and Data Privacy, Strategy and Transactions, with ENOI, that's a mouthful, and Paul Dickinson, who's a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Nemat?
Thank you very much, Saba. It's great to be here with the other IAG members, members of the board, as well as Saba, and a great panelist. Just give you background, my name is Nemat Shroff. I'm a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. We have two excellent panelists here. As Saba briefly introduced them, Brian Levine is Managing Director at EY, in charge of cybersecurity and data privacy, among many other things. He joined EY from the Department of Justice, where he served as a federal prosecutor and senior counsel with the DOJ's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section. And prior to that, he served as an Assistant Attorney General for the Internet and Technology Bureau at the New York Attorney General's office, and has tons of litigation experience. Our other panelist is Paul Dickinson, who is a partner, an auditing services partner at PwC, and his focus is on IT methodology and cybersecurity, and extensive experience again with in this topic. Prior to joining PwC, Paul is a retired lieutenant colonel at the U.S. Air Force Reserves, and he's here with us now. So I thought we will get started with some of the basics. So I was hoping we'd start with you, Brian. So if you can start us off by helping us understand just the nature of cybersecurity risks issuers face, and perhaps if you can walk us through the life cycle of a cyber event.
Sure. Well, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I will start by noting that this was sold to me as a panel, just like a regular panel, and what we actually have here seems more like a congressional hearing. So if I had known that's what it was going to be, I would have had a tie, I would have had an entourage, I would have done all kinds of things, but apologies for the lack of formality. And thank you for your service, Paul. It's fantastic background there. So we're facing a lot of risks when it comes to cyber. Companies have a lot on their plate. So the first thing, I want to mention 5 things that companies are focused on these days that are sort of new. The first is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can be used by the good guys and the bad guys, but in many situations, in many ways, the bad guys are ahead of us already. How can they use it? For one thing, a lot of these guys are in foreign countries, Russia, Iran, other countries where English might not be their first language. Their phishing emails historically have not always been so great. Now they can, with quite little effort, create phishing emails that are very effective and not have to worry about people detecting broken English or poor grammar. Secondly, these guys can generate malware now. The software, the AI itself can write its own software, including malware. And they can make every variation of the malware completely different so that traditional antivirus can't detect it. Third is the deepfakes. You may have heard about this incident in which a cyber actor was able to use video deepfake to impersonate members of management and the board on a video call and directed an employee to make a $25 million wire transfer, which he did, to an account that the attacker controlled. $25 million, yes, and that worked. And who's going to say no when they have the CEO and the board on the video call? So that's a big challenge for everybody to deal with AI. The second area I want to highlight is ransomware. Ransomware has been a problem for quite some time now, and the problem is unfortunately only getting worse. So I think most of you are familiar with the basic idea of ransomware, but essentially companies get infected with this ransomware either through a bad actor directly or through malware that's sent out. It encrypts all of their files or a large percentage of them. And to be clear, these are not just the data files. These are not just like the Word documents, the Excel, the PowerPoint, the files you're used to using. These are the system files as well that make the computers run. So you can't even turn your computers on. And then the threat actor will demand a ransom, typically in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. We've seen ransom requests into 20 million range at this point. And what we're seeing now is what we call double, triple, quadruple extortion. So what the smart ransomware actors are doing now, because people are getting more savvy about their backups, they're getting better at that, and so they got to add another tool to their arsenal. And the new tool is, we're going to exfiltrate your data first, and then we're going to encrypt it. And so if you don't pay us the money, even if you have a backup, we will release your data publicly on the dark web or on the internet, wherever they want to release it. And so that gives you another little incentive to pay the ransom. We then see some bad actors getting even more creative with this. And recently, one of the bad actors not only encrypted the data, took the data, but also alerted the SEC on behalf of the company to the incident. So you got triple extortion there. So we're seeing ransom becoming more widely spread throughout the environment. Third issue I want to raise for you is vendor attacks. We're seeing this become very prevalent. And it makes sense from the bad guy's perspective, because why attack one company and impact one company when you can get 18,000 at one shot? So examples of this are SolarWinds, Kaseya, MoveIT, or MoveIt if you prefer. Recently, we had sort of a similar thing with CrowdStrike. It wasn't actually a attack, it was just a mistake, but it impacted a large portion of the economy. And these vendor attacks primarily impact IT and cyber vendors that have a lot of different clients that they have direct access to, but they can also impact other companies that aren't specifically IT cyber companies, and that can have a big impact. So for example, Kronos is the payroll processor or payroll vendor for turns out a very high percentage of the country, if not the world. When they had a ransomware attack, companies all over the country were unable to pay their employees on time. They had to move to a paper check situation, and the result was that many of these companies were sued by class actions of their own employees for being paid late, and are now entering settlements throughout the country. So vendor attacks is an increasing problem because the average company has hundreds to thousands of different vendors. It's very hard to keep track of them. Two other topics. The fourth is software vulnerabilities. It used to be, statistically, that the most likely way your organization was going to get hacked was through a phishing email. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. You're doing the phishing exercises probably in your organization, enjoying that quite a bit. Phishing is still prevalent, so don't think you can stop doing those phishing exercises. But the number one way we're getting hacked these days, there's a competitor in town, and the competitor is vulnerabilities. We're seeing software vulnerabilities and hardware vulnerabilities become the main ways that organizations are getting hacked. Bless you. And so the current administration, as part of its cybersecurity strategy, has taken quite a few steps to encourage the private sector to improve their software when it comes to, and their software development when it comes to vulnerabilities. But the problem is not going to go away quickly, and in fact, I predict that the problem may get worse now that AI is in the world, because programmers are using AI to draft portions of their code, and who knows whether that code is going to be as secure as if a human actually spent some time thinking about it. So software vulnerabilities, and then the last one, that probably in some ways the most serious cyber threat to companies and individuals is the regulators, my former colleagues, because almost every department has decided, every agency in the U.S., and it's federally, it's state, it's global, have decided that they also want to be cyber regulators. And I think it's because they realize that their kids don't think what they do in their day job is that cool. I think they think that if they go into cyber, their kids will suddenly think they're cool. And I'll tell you, I've been in cyber for some years now. It's not going to work. Your kids will still think you're uncool. So I'm encouraging. I don't think there's anything you can do. I don't know, maybe we'll have a debate about that. There may be nothing you can do to get your kids to think you're cool. But in any event, they're all in this space. They all think investors want to know about your security. Investors want to make sure you're spending adequately on security. They want to make sure, they want to protect consumers. They want to protect people who use transportation, people who use energy. They want to make sure the system continues to function. So it makes sense, but from the perspective of the regulated companies, they often have to comply with just a myriad of regulations that are not necessarily consistent with each other, and that are constantly evolving and having to constantly apply them to new threats and new technology. So they're having to say, well, how do these regulations apply now with, double extortion ransomware or with AI? And in fact, with AI, there's a whole nother set of regulations. There are currently at least 800 AI regulations that are either in place or being proposed and being debated globally that a lot of my clients have to think through and try and figure out how they comply with. So that's kind of the world we're living in at this moment. You ask me in a couple weeks, might be an entirely different story.
And I'd like to add to that. So that's the threat landscape, and the companies are grappling with that now. They're also implementing new applications and new systems, making required upgrades. They're moving things to the cloud, which exposes potentially even more risks. And they're dealing with remote workers, which opens up more avenues for threat actors to get into their environment. So the threat landscape, to Brian's point, is changing weekly, it feels like.
This makes a good start for a horror movie, huh? All right, Brian, Paul, let me loop you in. What role do auditors play in managing these risks, the risks that Brian mentioned? Do auditors play a role in making sure that investors obtain accurate information about cyber risks and disclose this information, how it relates to financial statement accuracy? As such, it'll be helpful for us to know helpful for us to understand where the auditor's role begins and ends.
That's a good question. So the auditor, we're focused on the financial statements, financial reporting, and controls over financial reporting. So when we think about how we interact with the company, it's around financial reporting applications that roll into financial reporting, which is a subset of the overall company's applications and network. Right? So we go through a process, we meet with companies, we understand from leadership, top-down risk-based approach, how management is performing their risk assessments, and then we factor that in looking at various things that we would consider exposure areas, right? So a cyber exposure area, as an example, may be, Brian had mentioned vulnerabilities. Does management have patch vulnerability assessment? Do they have a patch controls in place? What about backups and recovery? Can they recover their financial data timely in order to meet their financial reporting obligations? So we understand at that risk assessment level, as part of planning for the audit, through the various conversations, we understand what management's doing as far as their threat assessments, what controls do they have in place, how do they have an incentive incident management response plan in place as part of all of our planning. We then bake that into how we do our testing for the audit.
I see. So it's fair to say that the internal control systems are a crucial aspect of mitigating this cybersecurity risk, right? So as part of that, like, what measures do auditors take to proactively address some of these concerns?
Yep, so after we go through our risk assessment, we understand what their controls are. So again, financial statement focus, look at the financial statement line items, the ones that are what we consider material to the financial statements, and then we break it down from there. What controls does management have in place, right? These can be application level controls, IT general controls, business process controls. Some of those controls relate to cybersecurity, right? We mentioned backups. I had mentioned patch management. As an example, another example, vendor management and wires. So is there a risk that a company could be subjected to a business email compromise that's looking for a bank account change? And if that's the case, does management have controls in place that mitigate that risk of an unauthorized bank account change? We would look, if we think that's a risk to the audit, we would then go test that control, which is typically a callback control that management would have in place where they would call the vendor and verify the bank account change. So that's the way we factor in cyber risks, management identified cyber risks that we agree with, right, into the way we do our audit.
Brian, let me come back to you. I mean, from what you described, it seems like cyber risks or some sort of cyber event is inevitable. Like every company, if a bad actor wants to go after some company, they are likely to be able to have some degree of success. I mean, from given your extensive experience in dealing with some of these risks, like, can you walk us through what happens next? If you're a company, if you're the CEO of a company, you get attacked, what does the next week of your life look like?
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't look good. It's not a happy time. I don't know any CEO who gets attacked and then goes to Tahiti for that week. But the key to navigating an incident is preparing in advance for the incident. So if you have done nothing to prepare for the incident, that week is going to be horrendous. What companies need to be thinking about in advance of the incident is, one, creating an incident response plan. And the more detailed that incident response plan, the better. In fact, what smart companies are doing right now is creating what's called incident response playbooks. So they're taking every likely scenario that could happen with respect to an incident and mapping the response out specifically to that type of incident. So you'd have a ransomware playbook. You'd have a insider theft playbook. You'd have a PII breach playbook. You'd have a business email compromise playbook. So you know what you're going to do in each of those situations. And then the smart companies are testing that playbook out at least annually through tabletop exercises where they ideally have a third party come in, and sometimes the third party will technically simulate the attack so their systems actually see it happen. And then they will meet with various members of the company. And what we're seeing now is, historically, those mostly happened at the IT level, just the really tactical people. Now it's happening at the executive level and even at the board level, getting involved in these tabletop exercises. And what the statistics show is that companies that are well prepared and do the things I just mentioned, the cost of the incident statistically goes down by almost 50%. From those companies that were less well prepared. That's a big number. I wasn't expecting that statistic when it came out. I thought it might be less, but apparently it makes quite a big difference. So that's what companies are doing, and part of that, when you do the practice, you realize things very quickly, like I didn't print out the incident response plan, and now it's on my encrypted computer. So it's worthless. So you realize something very simple, like print out the incident response plan, or I have right here the incident responder's phone number and the breach counsel's phone number. I am going to call them. And you call them and you realize they left that firm. And you can find them at the other firm, but you don't have a retainer agreement with the other firm, and you have to go through conflicts, and you can't do that in the amount of time you need. So you learn things pretty quickly, by practicing, and that's going to improve your response.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, just a question. It was something that Paul said about being concerned about cyber risks that are materially important for the financial reports. And is that leaving a gap that should there be another set of eyes beyond the auditor in terms of cyber risk? The context is I'm a trustee of a public pension fund. We have an investment consultant. We have an actuary. They have told us cyber is not their main job, that we should have now a cyber risk consultant, which maybe Brian is a big
I'm a fan.
a big fan. But seriously,
Yeah.
seriously, in terms of the protection on this, should there be a dedicated cyber advisor / consultant?
Actually, I'll jump in there. So I was chair of the LA County Employee Retirement Association Audit Committee, and we definitely had a cyber, and we had regular pen testing. And in fact, I think, John Grable, you guys did tabletop exercises on Wire, et cetera,
Quarterly.
quarterly.
Different scenarios, but yes.
And we are seeing that when a cyber incident does occur, as auditors, we'll typically we either get a phone call from management pretty quickly, or we get notified through an 8K disclosure, and then we get engaged to understand what management's doing to respond to that. They do have companies on retainer that come in to help them through the cyber incident process. Now, as far as the consulting side of things, prior to that, I can imagine, Brian, you do some work in that space.
It's a great question. The audit, while super important, is focused on a narrow slice of the cyber picture. They're looking at different standards, they're using different standards, and they're looking at the financial reporting, to your point. If you think about how many applications a particular large organization has, it's more than are on your phone, it's more than are on your kid's phone, and only some of them relate to financial reporting. So what I would recommend, I think best practice, is to have a third party, whether it's mine or different, come in at least annually and do what I call a cyber program assessment. So I analogize that to going to the doctor once a year for your annual physical. This is the generalist. And they're looking at your program overall, and they're gonna figure out what tests to order based on the program overall. So someone mentioned a pen test. The pen test is like a blood test, but it's one particular blood test. There are a lot of different tests out there that you may wanna run. The pen test, for example, is not touching at all typically your software, your custom applications, which is where there may be a lot of vulnerabilities. So there's a number of different specific tests you wanna run each year, but you also wanna have the overall third-party view of your cyber program generally. And I am a big proponent that the report that comes out of that should go directly to the board of directors and the audit committee. It shouldn't be filtered before that by the CISO or the CIO or whoever that is, in terms of best practice, because there's a reason you're having an independent person doing this assessment in the first place, and it defeats some of the purpose of that if it's then going to be filtered by the CISO and the CIO and others before it gets to the board. Now, I recognize the board's probably not going to scrutinize, or at least not every member of the board is going to scrutinize every page of that, but at least they have the opportunity to. At least they can look at the executive summary, they can look at the critical findings.
And as an external auditor, we would use that as some of the information that leads into our risk assessment and the impact to the financial audit.
Alicia?
Paul, or perhaps Brian as well, can you share the perspective on how you apply the concept of materiality in terms of making the assessment of cybersecurity risks, given that the magnitude of the attack is more than likely going to result in the size of the claim?
So the materiality assessment is your standard materiality assessment, is the mix of information relevant to the investor, right? So that's up to the company and their legal counsel to sort through. Should they determine that, should a issuer determine that they have a material cyber event, they'll disclose it appropriately. What is often, then they need to shift. So that's materiality in the context of perhaps dollars, other things go into that materiality assessment, brand risk, reputation, things like that. There's also a root cause analysis that should be done in the context of internal controls over financial reporting. So do we not only have a material cyber event happen, do we also have a material weakness in our internal controls over financial reporting? So that's the second step that issuers need to take in their assessment. And again, we're along for the ride and helping understand, for us to understand their process as they go through both the materiality assessment and the ICFR material weakness assessment.
That's a great question. I've been meeting with a lot of public company board of directors and audit committees, especially since the SEC cyber rules came out, which are more explicit about requiring disclosure of material cyber events. And boards have been confused and concerned about what is a material cyber event. And it only comes up, it's only an issue when it's not obvious, right? I mean, like, so some of the really big ones, they're clearly material, no one has a question there. And then there's some that are clearly de minimis and nobody's gonna think they might possibly be material. But it's, most of them fit somewhere in the middle, and because the SEC has, I think, correctly said that you need to consider the impact on reputation, in deciding this, and the impact on operations and the impact on customers and et cetera, which is part of the standard materiality analysis. It's a little bit hard to know what that's going to be because some of it is very long term. So what I think most companies, or many of the companies I've been speaking to, have been doing, and somewhat to the SEC's dismay, is just disclosing incidents early and often, essentially, whether they think they're material or not. And I actually think that's the better approach, despite the SEC's agita over that. And part of the reason is it's not just the SEC and the other regulators that you have to worry about. Anytime there's an incident, you're going to get a class action from your plaintiff, from your shareholders, and from your victims whose information got out there, and from other parties. And every single one of those complaints I see, one of their arguments is that the company was negligent because they didn't disclose the incident early enough. It could be 3 days after the incident. That still wasn't early enough. But it doesn't matter. But that will be one of the allegations, because they will say, I could have mitigated some of the harm if I had known about this incident earlier, which in many cases is true, or at least in some cases is true. And so it's in the company's best financial interest, I think, to disclose these incidents early and often, whether they meet the threshold for materiality or not. And frankly, I don't know that investors care that much about whether the company thinks it's material or not. I think they just want to know that the incident occurred, here are the facts of the incident, and I think as an investor, I'm almost in as good a position as the company to decide whether that matters or not.
It's kind of like Bloomberg columnist Matt Levine talks about how everything is securities fraud. Get sued for anything, anytime there's anything bad. Gina.
So one of the comments that you made, Brian, was the drowning in regulation. And I will say from an audit committee member perspective, and this is specific because we were in the public sector, but now I'm in a private foundation, is that the often the sort of approach and the methodologies cannot really be well defined in the report that you get from your auditor. And we do operational audit, but some of those do bleed into the control environment, and so there's a lot of overlap. For example, having people request wire changes for their pension checks would be a control gap. And if we didn't have a way to do that. But one of the challenges that I have is that the methodologies themselves vary a lot from consultant to consultant, depending on who you bring in. And in fact, your workflow could vary a lot if you change CISO, who then changes consultant, who then brings you, and you're busy working through the last like 300 recommendations from the last set of consulting audits, and you get a whole new set of consulting audits. So that's a bit of a challenge as well in terms of just understanding, has there been a standardized approach to how to what the methodology should be for sort of testing these various areas? Has it standardized, or does everybody have a different way to sort of skin this cat?
You want to start in the audit context, or?
Well, in the audit context, there's a fairly, we go off the auditing standards that the PCAOB put forth, and we follow the SEC. At my firm, we look at a number of cyber risk exposure areas: vendors and wires, backups, intrusion detection and prevention, and patch management, right? We look at those as kind of higher risk areas from a cyber perspective, and we factor that into the way we plan and execute our audit. I think more broadly, my sense is you're probably heading down the NIST framework.
Yeah,
right,
so more broadly,
as a framework.
More broadly, there are various frameworks out there. There's NIST, there's ISO 27001, there's High Trust, which is in the healthcare space, it's a certification. So there are various frameworks, and I encourage companies to pick a framework, just like one framework, ideally, and use that to sort of benchmark your program over time. I find that when companies, because I do a lot of cyber diligence, I've looked at probably over 450 companies in the context of acquisitions. And when those companies say, when you ask them do they have a framework, and they list 3 or 4 frameworks, it usually means we're not following any religiously. And I'd rather see you follow one religiously than, just take best practices. So there are frameworks we can use, but then the specific methodology within those frameworks and the specific controls are going to vary. And it's in part because technology is changing so rapidly. The number of the different vendors are available changes so rapidly. The threats are changing so rapidly that you kind of have to think on your feet a little bit with respect to cybersecurity. And every different company has different risks. And that's part of the problem we see out there is that people think cyber risk generally, but there are different types of risks within cyber, and different companies should be focused on what is the risk that would affect their company the most, not what would affect a different company the most.
Actually, let me come to you, Paul. Oh, John, go ahead.
Thank you. And maybe building on that last comment and Alicia's question is twofold. One is, how do you think about materiality of cyber events at the hyperscalers, at the companies that are providing the infrastructure and trying to protect all your clients, your companies, all their clients? Secondly is, in some ways, cyber instances, your knowledge of it may be nested. That if something happens in company A, you're auditing companies B, C, D. How do you build upon that knowledge? How do you share that knowledge? And how does the materiality of an incident that may be too small at one client, but in the aggregate may be material across an entire sector?
So as far as hyperscalers, those type of companies, I think the materiality assessment would be, it's that mix. It gets back to the mix. So I think it's hard to be able to pinpoint what would be material for one hyperscaler and that impact and versus another. And I do think impact does matter, right? How broad and deep is that impact across their customers and their clients? As far as your nesting question, that is looked at in the context, if you're referring to like connected companies, you have a group audit, maybe some component teams.
Just different companies that may be in different companies, but that just may use that same vendor.
Again, I hate to say this, but it's going to be varying facts and circumstances with each of those companies and the materiality thresholds and the way that the companies view and use those hyperscalers. So it could be material to a smaller company using a hyperscaler, but in the context of a broader, larger company, it may not be material. That mix may not have an impact to investors.
Yes, so I would say the hyperscalers, if they have an incident that had the potential to, or either did or had the potential to impact a lot of their clients, they're going to want to err on the side of disclosing that one. Usually these are going to be material. This is a big risk that I'm seeing now. I've kind of developed a concept of 5 harms that I think these are all harms sort of break into in the cyber world. And one of them I call weaponization. This is my name for vendor risk, or supply chain risk, or a third-party risk, but you're the vendor. And so when you're the vendor, I haven't seen a name for it, so I just call it weaponization. And so the hyperscalers are the ones that are most likely to be weaponized against all of their customers or clients. We saw this with one recently with respect to a foreign country wanting to do espionage on government emails, which was accomplished through this hyperscaler. I'm purposely not naming them, but I think you probably know who I'm talking about. So that has a tendency to veer into materiality in most instances, and I think most of them are probably pretty good about disclosing these, though I guess I don't know what they're not disclosing. I don't know what they don't know. From the company standpoint, if you're using, so CrowdStrike was a good example, because that wasn't even an attack, that was just an error, a screw up, as Gina called it. So CrowdStrike impacted thousands of businesses. For some of them, it was a material impact. For some of them, it was not. So it's just going to depend upon how you were using that vendor, how many different endpoints were impacted, and how long they were impacted, and what is your business like? Because some businesses actually don't need to be online all the time. I did diligence on a soap company once, and I thought that being offline would prevent them from making the soap. Turns out they outsource making the soap. There's a third party that actually makes the soap. So I said, well, but surely you need to be online for the sales. Turns out that they outsource the sales. So they didn't need to be online for that. I was like, what do you use your computers for? They said, well, they're kind of paperweights, really. We could go on indefinitely if we had a ransomware attack. So most companies don't fit into that category, but the point is, it's going to be very diverse in terms of the impact that an attack like that has.
And Jonathan, I will share, getting back to your broader scalar question, when there is a broad-reaching impact or a broad-reaching vulnerability, Log4j was one that happened several years ago. As auditors, we'll ask our clients, are we impacted by that, and assess and factor that into our risk assessment, right? And I do know that the regulators also look at certain broad-reaching vulnerabilities as well, and ask us questions and how we factor that into risk assessing these clients.
So something you said, Paul, earlier made me think of a question. Let's say it's the end of the year. One of your clients is hit with a ransomware attack that shuts down their payroll system. What do you do during the year-end audit? Like, what are the next steps that the auditor takes?
Maybe I'll take you through the auditor's perspective of a ransomware attack and walk through that. So when a company will either disclose with an 8K, which alerts us, or they'll call us, which typically happens, to say, hey, we're dealing with something. We let the company work through their procedures, but we stay close. We also bring in an expert in the security space technically that the engagement team can use to understand technically what's happening at the company, and then translate that information into auditor speak. Why do we care about it? As we work with the company and they go through their procedures, we're also assessing, do we need to change our audit plan? Do we need to change our risk assessment? The company gets to a point where they make a materiality decision. Is it material or not material? They'll make an ICFR decision. Do I have a material weakness or not? And go through the procedures they need to go through. If it's at the end of the year, payroll is hit, the hope is they're able to recover from backups quickly to be able to make payroll or cut checks. But the part of that assessment is, are you heading down the path of timely financial reporting? You mean the end of the year? Part of the assessment around the control piece is backups and recovery. Were they working to allow the company to file their financial statements on time? And if not, that could be a material weakness in their ICFR environment.
I see, okay. But depending on, from what I understood of what Brian said, depending on what the ransomware attack is, they might take your data, including your backups, before anything
They absolutely could.
happens.
Yeah, we've actually seen some threat actors come in, take data, get into the backups, and blow up the backups. So there's no way for a company to be able to recover and without paying the ransom, is the theory.
Well, and people should be aware. People think that if they, I'm just going to pay the ransom. Like, if I get hit, I'm going to pay the ransom. I don't have to worry about it. Even if you pay the ransom, you don't always get your documents back. But even if you do, it still takes weeks and sometimes longer than that to stand yourself back up. And even if even if you're doing it from the backups, if you don't pay and you have backups, that still takes some time to put back up as well. So if you do get hit, you're going to have to deal with a big problem regardless of what approach you take.
Yeah.
So what do you, in this case, Brian, have you had conversations where what do you advise clients to do if they are hit with a ransomware attack? Because on one hand, you could see if they pay the ransomware, then it might incentivize subsequent ransomware attacks, right? But if you don't pay the attack, then you're not able to prepare your year-end financial statements. You're not able to function in the short run.
Right.
So how do investors, how do boards think about this issue? How does management think about
Well,
this?
the first thing is, per my earlier answer, you need to prepare for this in advance. You shouldn't be thinking about it for the first time when it happens. Part of that is lining up competent people to help you with the situation. Ultimately, the decision of whether to pay ransom is a business decision, and it has to be a business decision. There's a lot to weigh. But you want to get the best advice from everybody you can. And so first is the FBI. Having worked with the DOJ for 7 years, and I was the national coordinator for all the computer hacking and IP prosecutors around the country, 300 of them, so I went around and talked to private industry. And the FBI can be enormously helpful in these situations. People are nervous about calling in the FBI, so you want to consult with your outside counsel, but the benefit greatly outweighs the concerns, which are mostly based on myths. One, they're able to tell you if you pay the ransom with this particular group, what is likely to happen. Are you going to get your backups? Are you going to be able to get back online? How long is it going to take? Or are they going to hit you up for another ransomware payment or release your data publicly, regardless of what you do? Two, they sometimes have decryption keys, and that's in part because they're often doing these big investigations and they've got someone who has access to a server. They're on the inside at some level. And so sometimes they can help you with a decryption key. We saw that with Hive ransomware a while ago. It won't happen every time. But third, they can help. They've been through it a lot. And hopefully your company hasn't. So they can help you get back up and ready and give you good advice around that. So I do recommend consulting with the FBI. And what I would suggest is having a contact in advance. I tell everybody, don't wait to an incident to get an FBI contact, because you might be listening, tapping your toes to a lot of jazz music, a lot of light jazz as you're waiting to get help, and it might not be timely. So have a contact in advance, have their exact cell phone number. The other thing I'll say is you want to have breach counsel at the reach. Because if you're considering paying ransom, first of all, the Treasury has sanctioned a whole bunch of ransomware actors through the OFAC program. Actually, when I was with the DOJ, I worked with the Obama administration on an executive order to enable Treasury to sanction significant malicious cyber actors. And at the time, we discussed whether this would be used on ransomware actors or not, and we didn't initially, but now they're doing it. And what that means is if you're hit by one of those ransomware groups that are subject to OFAC sanctions, you could run afoul of the law by paying the ransom. So you at least need to talk with counsel to understand what your risk is around there. So the bottom line is these aren't decisions to think about for the first time when the incident happens. You really have to have this planned in advance.
Okay.
Just a quick comment. I'm on the board of a company called Fortinet, which had a ransom very recently, and it's amazing. They got some data. There was a service provider we were using in the cloud. It affected only a small subset of customers. The company and we all agreed not to pay the ransom. It kept on going down and down and down, and ultimately we didn't pay. We did connect with some of the customers, and then finally it got out publicly, but it was fine because it was a relatively small amount. So, but we did just like you said. We went to the FBI, worked with our outside counsel. It was like $1.5 million. It was a small amount of money, but anyway, we decided not to publicize it.
Well, that's great. I always, my preference, of course, is to not pay the bad guys. I don't think anybody wants to pay ransom, but that there are some companies that are in a very difficult situation because everything is encrypted, and the alternative is to go bankrupt. And that has happened a couple of times. And there was one incident in recent memory where a company in Texas paid the ransom, still didn't get usable versions of their data back, and filed for bankruptcy. So, while I always prefer the idea of not paying the ransom, sometimes you're between a rock and a hard place.
Gina?
And if you could please turn off your mic if you're not speaking. Thank you.
So, so we go through our quarterly cyber education, and very recently, actually, I wanted to comment on the need to know who your FBI contact is ahead of time. Is we were informed in our last quarterly update that the latest version of double and triple exposure was that they would come at you with ransomware, and then they would call you posing as the FBI, offering to help you. so that also was a thing. But it is very real. I can tell you that and they are going after significant infrastructure as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so what I would say on that, they get cleverer every day. Sometimes with the ransomware, when they were initially going after individuals, and they still do this, they will work through call centers in other countries. So, like, if you need to know how to make the ransomware payment in Bitcoin, they have somebody there 24/7. They're probably paying a very small amount. Maybe they don't even know that they're part of a crime to help you launder your money to this bad guy. But yes, so in terms of getting somebody, having a specific contact at the FBI has a private sector industry group called InfraGard. You can become a member of that group, and that's a great way to meet particular FBI agents. The other thing you can do is if you go on the FBI website, you can find a local office and the number for a local office and ask to speak to a cyber agent. And for big companies that have a global footprint, I would consider having an FBI contact in each of your major jurisdictions. And certainly, by the way, and most companies aren't thinking about this, where their servers are located, because that's often where the jurisdiction is, not where your physical building is.
Just on this, in preparation for a cyber event, can you speak to who is at a high risk of a cyber attack and who's at a low risk? And Paul, I presume this applies to you guys as well, because this affects client acceptance and client retention decisions, right? Or even how you come up with audit pricing, because it seems like, a cyber incident could run havoc during a year-end audit. Right?
Absolutely. The prominence of the company. Is it a global company, a multinational company? What industry or sector are they in? What data do they maintain? Is it personal health information? Is it financial information? A multinational corp technology company is very different than a domestic brake manufacturer. Different risk profiles, different cyber risk profiles. So they absolutely come into into play.
So this is where I'm going to answer with my 5 harms, because the thing is, there is no company that doesn't have high cyber risk, really, other than that soap company I mentioned. They are an exception. But when you think about what the 5 harms are, and think about your own companies that you represent, that you deal with, you're going to fit into some of these. So the first harm is PII, sensitive information, whether it's personal identifying information, personal health information, personal finance information, biometrics, any of this. If the company has a large volume of it, that's a risk, that's a harm. And the risk is, the harm would be having it exposed, having it deleted, or having it adulterated. Let's not forget about that. Imagine you have medical information and someone's going in and changing the medical information, and so then you get prescribed a drug that could kill you. So adulteration of that PII is also a risk. So that's the first. Second is proprietary information. So here I'm talking primarily about trade secrets, but I don't like to use that term because people think of it more narrowly than it actually is. When I say trade secrets, I mean any information that you try and keep secret that if it were out there would give competitors or other people an advantage. So that could be customer lists, it could be vendor lists, it could be pricing, it could be business plans. It doesn't have to be something technical. The third is operational risk. What companies need to operate? Virtually all of them. I mean, the soap one didn't for some reason, but most companies need to operate. The more urgency there is for you to operate and the more requirement that you use technology to operate, the more you can be impacted. The fourth is weaponization. That's the one we discussed earlier. That's your company being used to attack your clients, your vendors, your partners. And then the fifth is asset theft, just stealing assets directly. So who has the greatest risk for this? These are companies that do a lot of transfer of money or goods. So we see it, in financial institutions, crypto companies that are transferring money. Those are the ones that can be used most effectively to get them to transfer it to the bad guys instead of to who they're intending. But I've also learned, I was speaking at the Transportation Risk Conference, and they're seeing this too, where it's not that they're directly stealing the money, they're stealing whatever the cargo, essentially. So they'll go in and instead of changing who the account information, they'll change the delivery information. So the truck driver is bringing a big truck of cargo to a warehouse and drops it off, and it's, then after he leaves, the bad guys just take all that stuff and go somewhere else. So direct asset theft. So when you think about those 5 harms, you realize that they're very rare soap companies that fit outside of this and don't need to think about cybersecurity.
Yeah, let me follow up a little bit and then we'll go to Ken. But coming back to the SEC's disclosure rules, where the SEC talked about how companies are required to disclose information about the cyber risks and, in some sense, the protections that they take to prevent against cyber threats. I mean, it sounds like those disclosures can actually aid bad actors, right? And this was, I think, some of the concern that came up during the disclosure rules. So can you comment on it?
Yeah.
Is this a real concern? How much
It's not. So the SEC specifically said that they don't want companies to disclose at a level of detail that would give bad guys a leg up in figuring this out. And in my experience, companies are taking that to heart and not exposing that level of detail. So for example, they're not exposing the specific tools and vendors they're using to secure their environment. If one knew that a particular company was using, say, CrowdStrike, since we've been talking about it because of their accident, then if a bad guy knew about a vulnerability in CrowdStrike, they could specifically attack the company based on that vulnerability. So while that is a theoretical concern, companies should not be disclosing either their vendors or their tools or their vulnerabilities or their weaknesses at a level that they think would increase their risk. And what my counsel would be to a company is, if you think that the SEC is requiring you to disclose something that's going to put you at risk, you want to consult with the counsel or the SEC itself before disclosing that. But as a default, I would err on the side of not disclosing it, because I don't think the SEC ever wants you to disclose something that's going to increase your risk. So disclose it at a much higher level of generality so that it's not going to put you at risk.
But isn't the flip side of that then investors do not know what protections what protections companies have?
We were talking about this because one question is, what should investors do here? Well, there's two kinds of investors. There are investors like, I'm going to buy the company, or I'm going to buy a major share of the company. Those investors should do really good due diligence. And that's not public. They should do cyber diligence. They should hire a big firm to do that. They should do technical testing if they can, or get the results of their technical testing. But my feeling is, while the other investors may want to consider cybersecurity in making their investment decisions, it's pretty hard to do that effectively. And I think for those investors, they're better off just diversifying rather than trying to figure out which companies are best protected and which ones are not. Except for on the real periphery, where there's some that are sitting ducks maybe and some that are Fort Knox.
And when you think about the SEC rules, it's disclosing the nature, time, and scope of the event, right? There's a lot of latitude there on how much and how little they can and disclose on the cyber event.
Okay. Lisa.
Thank you, Nemeth. Nemeth and I were talking last night at dinner about the fact that there seem to have been so many of these cyber attacks and so much of information is already out there. Is there a way to think about whether this comes to an end because there's not much more left to attack? Or is there always...
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think the value of things like someone's social security number and someone's phone number and this is going to keep going down from that perspective. But this is just, the people who want to get rid of cybercrime, who is expecting it's going to happen, have to remember we haven't been able to get rid of any kind of crime. Any crime that you can imagine that existed for probably the days of the cavemen is still going on. And so, it's frustrating being in law enforcement. It's always whack-a-mole, but you always have to keep going after them. You always have to keep going after the problem. If certain information becomes fully exposed and less valuable, there'll always be more information behind it, or there'll always be other ways to impact people. I mean, we just saw, this isn't a cyber crime per se, but we just saw a country figuring out how to get their adversaries' pagers and walkie-talkies to explode. Now, that was involving physical tampering, but you could imagine a cyber version of that, and there may have been a cyber aspect to that particular version. So the problem is never going to go away, and is my prediction. It's just going to kind of continually morph as technology morphs.
Pivoting a little bit, what about the effect of different regulatory... What about the effect of different regulatory regimes on cyber threats or cyber risk management? Because Europe, again, is quite different than what rules exist in the US, right? So how do multinational companies manage this? Is this affect the financial reporting of issuers? Can you all speak to that?
So for U.S. registrants, we follow the rules here in the U.S. And as depending on the data that is if there's data theft, if it's PHI, if it's personal information under the European GDPR or others, that's up for the councils for the entities to comply with those European regulations, right? But from our perspective, we, for U.S. companies, we audit under the U.S. standards and rules.
So what I've seen, because again, I've looked at all of these different companies, what they're mostly doing, the way they're mostly handling this, is they're figuring out which of these regulations pose the greatest threat to them. So which countries are actually enforcing their regulations and enforcing them heavily, and which countries do they have a large presence in where there could be a major cyber incident. It is really hard, especially for smaller to medium-sized companies, to attempt to comply with all of the regulations out there. And I've discovered this in particular with China as an example, because a lot of our clients do business in China, have offices in China. Turns out China has like hundreds, maybe more, of cybersecurity and data privacy regulations in different provinces and they have various different versions of this. But the thing is, the vast majority of them are not being enforced. There's only a handful that are. And so companies need to, and they do, get savvy about which of the ones they actually have to focus on at this moment. They try and comply with those. They try and bite off the biggest nut. So often it's GDPR. For many of them that do business in Europe is the high watermark. They try and comply with GDPR and hope that gets them 90% of the way with respect to compliance with the other regulations out there. In many cases that will work. It's not going to get you 100% of the way there, but you got to start somewhere.
Yes, thank you. It's a great discussion. I appreciate you taking the time. I'm just curious, and Paul, this might be more for you, but certainly Brian, chime in. From a financial reporting perspective, and we talked a little bit earlier about material weaknesses, so if an event occurs at a company, the auditor gets it notified, hopefully before an 8K, as you said, but gets notified. What do you, maybe two questions. What do you think about as the external auditor about what the significance of it from a financial reporting perspective? And then maybe second, as a broad statement, if you have a sense of how often when an event occurs it actually is decided and determined it is a material weakness versus something less.
So I'll start with the second question first. When we look at material weaknesses that have been reported in 2023, I think we tracked around 19 or so material weaknesses related to cyber events, and that's generally in the ICFR realm. When regarding your first question, so we go through the process with the company. The company's making decisions. We align with those decisions. We actually have a number of conversations with them. If as an example, a company had a cyber incident and records a material contingent liability, we would do our normal audit procedures over the reasonableness of that liability, and then if there's disclosures in the footnotes, we would also take a look at the disclosures in the footnotes of that liability. So we are close to them. We understand the decision-making process they're going through from a materiality perspective and from an ICFR perspective, and then we audit against those decisions. Generally, we agree. Does that answer, George, your question, or?
Yeah, I was just, yes, I guess what I was really thinking about, and maybe you touched on it, is there's an operational aspect that may, or as you said, the ICFR is a subset,
Yeah.
So there's an operational aspect, then you have the ICFR, and given the nature of cyber events, I think there's an automatic overlap of that, and just thinking how you think through that overlap, if you will.
Got it. Yeah, so I did not answer your initial question. So there's this concept of the did factor and the could factor, what I like to call it. So let's say a threat actor gets into a network and they decide to take a right-hand turn and go to the operational systems, right? They go to the plants, they shut the plants down. The company makes the decision to say we did not have a control ICFR issue because it's operational systems. We then have conversations with the company and help them understand whether there was a could factor involved. And a could factor means, okay, the did factor, they took a right and they shut down operational systems. Could they, through the same attack vector, had taken a left and impacted the financial statements, changed data, shut down the financial systems? And if the answer is yes, they could have, then the company would need to reassess whether or not they made the right decision on the material weakness over ICFR. And that did factor and could factor is a very hard concept. It's hard for me to understand until I went through it with one of my clients. It's a hard concept to get your arms around. But with the network, the way the networks are set up now with single sign-on, it could be fairly easy to go from an operational did factor to a material weakness in the could factor.
And by the way, this is where internal pen tests come in. So there's something called normally what you get is an external pen test. And that's the idea. You have a person like myself pretending to be a hacker trying to get into your network. that's part of a penetration test, but there should be an internal aspect too, where you say, what if this hacker already gets in? So you'd give me access to the network. And then, can I go left? Can I go right? Can I go up? Can I go down? And you want to figure out how to limit the attacker's access once they're in, so you don't fall into this could factor problem.
And an interesting assessment is the company goes through their assessment. They're going to go through some remediation. They want to fix the problem. So then we ask the question, okay, what are you doing to prevent that same attack vector, that same incident from happening again? And the company may say, we're doing 1, 2, and 3. We're doing these 3 actions. Those 3 actions we then look at to understand, was there a gap in the design of the controls initially? And does that now lead us down a path of whether the company has a material weakness or not?
Just one quick follow-up question on the could and the did factor. Let's say there's no cyber event. Is that something you, as an auditor, you think about without a cyber event triggering it in terms of your review of ICFR?
We do. We consider the could factor as we go through our controls assessment, for sure. Yep.
Board Member Thompson.
Thanks. Paul, just a follow-up question to that. Just looking at kind of the trends that you've seen over time, and I'm just asking in aggregate, are you finding more things in terms of the companies being what I would call preemptive? For instance, you got your checklist, you're looking at certain things, but you're finding maybe less because they are doing the incident, detection. They are having consultants coming in and giving them their own internal checklist from an ICFR perspective, or are you finding that there's still a lot that are just not getting the message, and you are having, through the audit process, kind of giving them their own, how to get better checklist?
We are seeing an increase in cyber awareness. We're seeing an increase in education through the companies, right? We're seeing an increase in the phishing. We mentioned phishing tests, exercises, and so forth. We are seeing them being more and more preemptive in nature, running through the scenarios that Brian laid out for our incident response plans. If X was to happen, how do we respond? And getting their ducks in. In fact, we as auditors, when we go in as part of our risk assessment, we look for things like that. We look for how proactive the company is being, and that helps us factor in the different areas we might look at from an external audit perspective. So I do think it's heading in the right direction compared to the way it was perhaps 5 years ago.
Brian, just a question. I know sometimes state actors mimic individual bad actors, so I just wondered how much of this in terms of cyber is maybe masked, but there's state actors involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not only is it sometimes difficult to determine whether it's a state actor versus an individual actor, but a big surprise to you may be that it's not just the U.S. Abroad, they don't necessarily pay government employees as much as the private sector. So many of these government hackers moonlight, and it's a real thing, and they attack companies to get some extra money at night. So it can be very difficult, by the way. So this is like why a lot of companies have a problem with this insurance clause that's been debated throughout the years about whether does it matter that it's a nation-state actor or not. At the end of the day, it can be pretty difficult to tell because they're coming in through various hot points. They're not coming in directly from China. They're not coming in directly from Russia. So it can be difficult to tell. I don't actually think the differentiation is as important as companies want to make it seem to be. I think a lot of the times it's an excuse. It's like, well, I'm never going to be able to, my defenses are never going to be able to be as good as Russia's or as China's. So, I'm going to throw my hands up. But I agree with Paul. What we have seen is an improvement in security overall, but it's super frustrating to companies because what they're saying is, I'm spending more and more on security. I'm doing all these things now, and the number of incidents is going up, not down. What is wrong here? And what's happening is, well, you're spending $1 million on security now. Now, if you don't do that, you're definitely going to get hit because the table stakes just rise. So the criminals all know how to go through if you don't have the basic defenses up, and then they're going to come up with the next thing, and it's just a constant cat and mouse game. So the answer is not to just throw your hands up and don't spend on cybersecurity, don't think about it. Unfortunately, you have to constantly think about it and constantly up your game.
So Brian, I mean, can you talk to us a little bit about what should investors or what should people on the board really ask management about their cybersecurity plans, about the risks that they face? Like, what conversations should we be having as investor advocates?
Yeah, so if you're on a board, first thing I would say is have your CISO or whoever it is presenting to you on cyber do a presentation to you on how you can most effectively oversee the cybersecurity function. And the reason I say that is not because you don't know, but because I don't think the CISO has always spent a lot of time thinking about how you can be effective. And so their presentations are often just to show off all the things they're doing and are not setting you up to be effective. And I think when the CISO or whoever it is doing their presentation has to think through how you can effectively oversee it, they're going to change their presentation style and they're going to change what information they're showing you. For example, if they just show a whole bunch of KPIs, look how great we're doing, we prevented 100,000 attacks, what are you supposed to say in response to that? There's like, great, congratulations. They need to be able to compare the KPIs they're showing you to other companies in the industry. They need to compare it to how they were doing before. They need to not just tell you what they are doing, but what they are not doing. So one of the things that I find particularly helpful is to look at the roadmap in terms of security and look at what is on the roadmap for the future and say, all right, I see these things are on the roadmap for the future. What risk is that preventing? How are we preventing that risk today? And if you're not satisfied with the way it's being prevented today, like, well, then why is that, like for a year, why is that scheduled for a year out? Should we do that sooner? So these are some of the ways that I think you can be more effective overseeing. I think there also has to be a decent amount of time spent on it. These days, if the board is meeting quarterly, some part of each of those quarterly meetings, I think, should be spent on cyber. And the audit committee should be probably spending more time on cyber. And what some companies are doing, depending on their cyber risk level, is having a separate cybersecurity committee, which can be made up by members of the audit committee and other members who are actually interested in the topic, because not everybody is interested in this topic as equally. But they can sit down and spend more time with the CISO or the relevant people getting to know the issues and getting to know what the risk areas are.
Yeah, it's board education as well, like upskilling the board around cyber risks and asking the inquisitive questions. We talked about the cybersecurity roadmap. There may be a CIO roadmap for new applications, and the board can ask questions around, have they considered cyber risks for these new applications, right, instead of just implementing them. So board education, I think, is critical as well in this space.
And it's not too hard to do. EY, for example, has a Center for Board Matters. You might all be familiar with that. I don't know. But, as part of that, I've done, free cybersecurity oversight and governance training to hundreds of boards out there.
A lot of firms have that. Yep.
Chair Williams.
Thank you. This is a very interesting discussion. So I know, Brian, you mentioned before AI, and we all know that companies and audit firms are becoming more invested in AI and generative AI. So with respect to the roadmap you were talking about, is there anything that people should be looking for in that roadmap specifically with the increased use of AI?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So responsible AI has become a whole assessment area. So as part of diligence that we're doing for investments, for acquisitions, we are doing responsible AI diligence. And some of that assessment is done through technical software that goes in and actually analyzes the AI and sees, is it biased? Is it going to have hallucinations? Is it compliant with regulations? And some of it is through old traditional means, reviewing documents and talking to people and understanding how it works. So part of it is going to be having a independent assessment of that, just like you're doing with cybersecurity. But part of it is going to be having an effective governance process over AI. And if you're not doing that, that's something the assessor will point out. So typically companies are now having a committee, a cross-disciplinary committee of folks who are involved in technology and law and ethics and DEI, thinking about the AI that they're developing. And it's not just the AI you're developing. That's one thing I want to be clear. Studies have shown that 70% of employees are using AI to do their work, whether you give them a sanctioned solution or not. They're using ChatGPT, they're using Google's product out there, they're using something. So if you don't give them a sanctioned way, they're still using it, and that's creating risk for your company. It's creating risk because AI is often wrong. It's because questions, prompts you put into AI may influence the AI going forward. If you put confidential information into the AI might spit that confidential information out to another person. So there's risks around that as well. So I mention that because some companies, they say, well, we're not in the AI business. We're not developing any AI right now. We don't have to worry about that. You do have to worry about it.
On the external audit side, we are collecting data as we go through our risk assessment and understanding how the companies that we audit are using AI, and if they're using AI in the areas of financial reporting as well.
Thank you.
So is there any such thing as overinvestment in cybersecurity? Because it seems like any budget that the company has can be insufficient to prepare for these threats, right? So at what point should a company say that, okay, this is what I'm willing to spend, and the optimal amount of risk that I face is not zero, it has to be something higher than that, right? So can you speak to that?
Yeah, there is. You can certainly because you can spend any amount of money you want on cybersecurity. There's probably a lot of other areas that you could as well. But I always tell, there's no such thing as perfect cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, not a destination. So you can't keep spending. And I see these reports. So when I do this diligence, one of the things I do is I look at what is the right amount of cyber insurance. And I have a partnership with a major cyber broker. And so I'm able to see, based on information I provide them, you know, what will 50% of the incidents cost? What will 75% of the incidents cost? What will 90% of the incidents cost? And what is the worst case scenario? And the difference between insuring up to 90% of the incidents and insuring up to like 99% is usually exponential. So I see very few clients, and I wouldn't necessarily advise trying to insure 100% of the incidents you might have. You want to insure some lower number, and I think the same rule in terms of ROI is going to apply across cyber spend. So you got to figure out, you know, when does it stop making sense to spend more? And sometimes it's not about the spend, but spending it wisely. Sometimes you have the wrong tools, you have the wrong people, your processes aren't particularly effective, and you can reorganize your existing program, spend less money, and have better security.
What does it mean, just clarification, what does it mean to protect against 90 or 99%? I mean, is it the type of threats, or is it like the first ransomware attack you're not protected against? But
It's like you know, are you going to fully insure against the most catastrophic attack you could possibly have? And I'll give you an example. It was because I keep talking about it. It just happened, CrowdStrike. So you know, people have been asking us, should I still use CrowdStrike? Should I still use EDR? What should I do differently? And our expert on that topic has been saying, like, this is sort of the once-in-a-lifetime meteor hitting the earth kind of event. And your program really shouldn't be based around that possibility, because you're probably going to way overspend to deal with that kind of incident that may never happen again, or may never happen again with your particular vendors. So that's what we're talking about. How much do you spend to prevent the meteor from hitting the earth and being impacted by it versus the type of cyber risks that are more likely to happen?
Thank you. Board Member Thompson.
You know, I think about the physical security industry, and they have all these, you know, places you can shop for your risk profile, and and whatnot, and they'll tell you to do all kinds of things to, insulate against that. I was wondering, is there kind of a similar thing that's sprung up on the cyber where, back to your point, Nimit, I can literally be scalable, but based upon my company, I can say, give me a, heat chart that tells me where I'm at, in terms of, the risk and whatnot. So just thinking, is that out there yet?
Yes, I would say yes. So it's maybe not quite that simple, but a lot of companies have said, like, we need to, first of all, we're small, we can't necessarily afford a very big assessment. We need to just get a sense of what are our broad risks. So while technology has been a problem with respect to cybersecurity, it's also a solution, as most issues of technology are. And so AI has been used to dramatically simplify the process of understanding what your cyber risks are. I'll give you a specific example of how there's been sort of cost savings around that. So a lot of companies are outsourcing their third-party risk management program because they have thousands of vendors. It's hard for them to keep on top of it, and it's more efficient, cost-effective for a company to just do that, to just manage the risk of third parties. And so now, for example, one of the things we do we're one of those companies that do that, and say we're taking a look at the security of a particular company, we just have them submit their documents, and we use generative AI to populate the answers to the questionnaires for those companies. And this is what their password policy, and it says not only here's the answer, but here is the document reference. So this is page 23 from their SOC 2 report. And then it just goes back to them, and they can take a quick look and confirm it's accurate, and it just reduces the cost considerably. So I don't know if there's a particular website that you can just go to and just ratemysecurity.com or something like that. But there are many, many vendors out there now who can do a more questionnaire type approach and make it much easier to sort of figure out where you are. I would then always have a conversation with a human, though, before you invest in security or decide I don't need security in this area, because we find that technology is still hallucinating, there's still issues, and you want some human judgment in there.
Thank you.
So this is a question that maybe is a part regulation question and part maybe legal precedent question. But at what point does this really start to become a question of negligence? You look at what happened at CrowdStrike, and that was sort of a classic IT governance code base issue, right? That shouldn't have happened in a good governance framework for merging code. But take that to just sort of simple things like if a company doesn't have cyber insurance, if a company doesn't have certain controls in place, at what point does this become a legal liability and therefore a material exposure to the company by virtue of not doing certain things, right? Because obviously there's a lot of things you could do, but what is the danger of not doing them today?
Yeah, so we're there already. I mean, the vast majority, close to 100% of class actions that you see related to cyber incidents include a negligence or negligence-like claim, and at the end of the day, the main standard that companies are being judged on is negligence. Now, the problem with that is that negligence is a very fuzzy standard, because the question is, what would a reasonable company in that particular company's shoes have done with respect to cybersecurity generally, and maybe with respect to the particular issue that you're talking about for MFA or for cyber insurance or whatever it may be. And the problem is, it's kind of hard to tell unless there's a regulatory requirement, which takes us to negligence per se, what constitutes reasonable. And as a result, partially as a result, the vast majority of these cases don't make it to a ultimate decision on negligence. They settle or they resolve some other way prior to a final determination. Is that helpful?
I mean, if there were a bunch of armed gangs running around the country breaking into homes and warehouses, the government wouldn't tell people hire private security, right? The government would beef up the police force to protect houses and warehouses. So where is the public sector here, or even the PCAOB should, yeah, obviously tell auditors to do as good a possible a job, but maybe pass up to the rest of the government, hey, maybe there should be more of a public sector response to this.
Well, it's a great point, Paul. There's a tension there. I think the government is trying to do really great things. We have CISA, which is done, really yeoman's work in trying to improve standards and educate. We have NIST that's coming out with regular information about how to improve security. You have the Department of Homeland Security, you have DOJ, you have FBI, you have just a whole range of agencies that are focused on this issue, and I think doing good work in it. The challenge is, to your analogy to having armed guards over there from the government to protect you from armed gangs, is most companies and individuals don't want the government on their actual systems. They don't want them to have access to their technology and their data.
But the police aren't in my home.
Yeah.
They're patrolling the streets. They're building they're protecting the public infrastructure of roads and so on.
Yeah, and so there's a balance, right? There's a balance there, and maybe the balance can be stricken a little better, a little better than it currently is. I think so the analogies are not perfect, because the streets you can kind of stand in and see, oh, look, there's a guy with a gun, I'm not going to let him forward here. Whereas the digital streets are all encrypted. So, data is moving through, you can't see who's a bad guy with a gun and what is information that company needs. So I think it's a little more challenging than the analogy would suggest. But I think everybody's working to try and strike that balance.
I mean, and I suspect part of it is threats are from international locations, right? The bad actors are not within the U.S., so then I think that to some degree, I imagine, constrains the ability of regulators in the U.S. or like the DOJ to actually go after actors in foreign countries.
I mean, that's absolutely true. So we have a great relationship with the vast majority of countries out there, and most countries will help us obtain digital evidence and get it to us so that we can prosecute people and identify people. They will extradite people to the United States. We've had a lot of success with countries. When I was with the DOJ, I went to Romania 7 times, chasing cyber actors, including a guy who went by the moniker Master Fraud. That was actually his email address. And not that I want to encourage criminality, but I would just a basic recommendation: don't commit crimes, but if you ever do, don't name your email address or yourself after the crime you're committing. It dramatically limits your available defenses if and when you ever get caught. But to your point, we did, and he's now serving 20 years in prison in the U.S. So we went through trial. Yeah, that's the most important thing. Master Fraud is now in prison, but in the U.S. But a lot of this crime comes from countries that are not cooperative with us with respect to extradition, with respect to investigations, and they're safe havens, and there is a limitation there to what we can do. So that's a good point.
The last question, actually, is I mean, all our discussion so far is focused on issuers and cybersecurity risks faced by issuers. But what about the firms themselves, right? Because the firms also they hold a lot of confidential client data. Can you speak to the precautions firms take dealing with some of these risks?
My firm is a global network of member firms, right? So we have a U.S. firm, which is a separate legal entity than our U.K. firm, et cetera. But we do have one global CIO that oversees all the integrated systems, and so we operate like a global company. From that perspective, we go through risk assessments, things that we would expect our clients to do as a private firm, we go through similar procedures and assessments, so.
The cyber criminals know that if they can hit a law firm or an accounting firm or an audit firm or anyone who has tons, reams, gigabytes, terabytes of confidential client information about thousands of clients or hundreds of clients, that is hitting gold. So they're very much inclined to go after these very large institutions that have a lot of sensitive information. And so these very large organizations are often the best protected. I can tell you that we actually have a whole group of people who their full job is just responding to requests from clients and third parties to explain how we're protecting our data. Their whole job is just responding to those inquiries because we get them so often. So I think, you know, for the most part, these people, these firms think of themselves like defense contractors. They have the keys to the kingdom and they're trying their best to protect it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Saba, over to you.
Thank you, Namath. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Paul. This was very informative. Next is the IAG presentation regarding requests for critical audit matters. We are joined by Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of the CII and IAG member, as well as former IAG member and owner of RG Associates, Jack Zielinski. Jeff?
Sorry, Jeff. I wonder if it might be possible before we start on critical audit. I know Barbara was reporting back that there wasn't anything to report on critical audit matters, but there were some issues that have been raised at previous IAG meetings, and I was just wondering whether there was a timetable of response to those, or whether we might think about what the timetable of the response would be, because I think we had a really good meeting of minds about what it was that needed to happen, and Sandy wrote an excellent paper and so on and so forth, and just knowing that this is resulting in outcome, or will at some stage result in outcome, would be terrific.
Yeah, thanks. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can share publicly at this time. I don't have a timetable to share, but hopefully will in the near future.
Would there be likely to be a report back, Barbara, at the next meeting or anything like that? Or even that, are you nervous about?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Would there be likely to be a report back on this maybe at our next meeting, or what do you think?
We could try to include it in our standard setting update at your next meeting.
That'd be brilliant, thanks.
Thank you, David. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Saba. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I announce the 3 winners of the first annual IAG CAMI Awards, I first want to just provide a little background that was just referenced. So as many of you recall, at its June 2023 meeting of the IAG, we held a session devoted to critical audit matters, which included an expert panel moderated by our very own Sandra Peters. The purpose of that meeting was to explore, more than 3 years after the required implementation of AS 3101, investor views on CAMs relative to their initial potential. The expert panel was comprised of former PCAOB Chief Auditor Marty Baumann, former PCAOB Chief of Staff Samantha Ross, Dr. Colleen Hannesberg of Stanford Law School, and Jared Goodman of the Colorado Public Employees Retirement Association. Following the June 2023 meeting, Sandra Peters prepared a draft memorandum for IAG member input that included a recap of the June panel presentation and 7 IAG recommendations. A majority of IAG members responding to the memorandum approved its issuance. Sandra Peters presented the approved IAG memorandum and the 7 recommendations contained therein at the October 2023 IAG meeting. Of the 7 IAG recommendations, 6 were directed at the PCAOB board or staff. In my view, the most important of those 6 recommendations were the 2 recommendations to amend AS 3101 to 1, revise the especially challenging language used in the standard for identifying potential CAMs. Members of the IAG believe such language may actually be discouraging auditors from issuing potential CAMs. And at the June IAG meeting, Mr. Baumann indicated that the especially challenging language has, in his view, has been interpreted narrowly in a manner that results in a fewer number of CAMs being disclosed than the PCAOB had intended when the standard was issued. And I would note that a recent survey of 100 institutional investors by the Center for Audit Quality found that 58% of investors would prefer to see more CAMs in an auditor's report, and that 92% of investors use CAMs when they make investment decisions. The second recommended amendment to AS 3101 that was in Sandy's memo, and that I also strongly support, was to revise the description of how the critical audit matter was addressed in the audit, and that's found in the note to paragraph 14C of the standard. More specifically, the recommended amendment would eliminate the optionality that currently permits auditors to omit disclosing two categories of information about CAMs that are of great interest to many investors and were of great interest during the development of the standard, and that auditors have to date collectively refused to provide. Those two categories of information explicitly permitted in the standard, but to date have not been provided by auditors, are one, an indication of the outcome of the audit procedures performed, and two, key observations with respect to the matter. And I would note that the recent survey of 100 institutional investors by the Center of Audit Quality that I just referenced found that 51% of investors would support increasing the detail provided in the CAMs. So I'm hopeful that the PCAOB's current research agenda project, entitled Communication of Critical Audit Matters, will soon become a standard-setting project and result in proposed amendments to AS 3101 that address those two IHE recommendations. So another recommendation approved by the IHE that I strongly support is what we're talking about today, the IHE initiative to annually solicit public input requesting the submission of examples of critical or key audit matters that are believed to provide decision-useful information to investors. The objective of this annual IHE initiative is to encourage auditors to continually improve the quality of information communicated to investors in the audit opinions of public companies. And many of you know this initiative was officially launched at our April 2024 IHE meeting, and the PCAOB's Office of Investor Advocate issued an alert on April 29th requesting public submission of examples of critical or key audit matters from the 2023 Form 10K and Form 20F filers. And the alert stated that each submission should include an explanation of why each critical or key audit matter nominated provides decision-useful information to investors. As of the June 30th deadline, the IHE received submissions from 7 individuals or organizations referencing 26 individual key or critical audit matters from the 2023 audit reports of 12 registrants filing Form 10Ks or Form 20Fs. Of note, of the 26 individual key or critical audit matters referenced in the 7 submissions, 7 of those matters were from one registrant, and that was BP PLC. Following the deadline for submissions, the IHE members were asked to review the 26 individual key or critical audit matters that were nominated, along with the nominator's explanation as to why they believed the key or critical audit matter submitted provides decision-useful information to investors. IHE members were also provided an 80-plus page document that included other information related to the nominations for the review and analysis, including electronic links to the registrant's financial statements. After 2 rounds of IHE member voting, the 3 critical or key audit matters that received the most votes. The 3 critical or key audit matters received the most votes from IHE members were as follows. Number 1, the goodwill and indefinite-lived intangible assets critical audit matter by Deloitte & Touche LLP at Berkshire Hathaway, Inc. Number 2, the unpaid losses and loss adjustment expenses retroactive reinsurance contracts critical audit matter, again by Deloitte & Touche LLP at Berkshire Hathaway. And number 3, the raw material inventory write-downs critical audit matter by Ernst & Young LLP at Moderna, Inc. The 3 winning critical audit matters were all nominated by the same individual, Jack Zazelski of RG Associates, Inc., a former IEG member who joins us today via Zoom. Good afternoon, Jack. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Jeff. Hello, fellow former members. It's good to be back, even if it's ethereal and not in person. But I think Jeff did a great summary there on the background for having the need to have more input on CAMs.
So, Jack, can you explain to us why you believe the critical audit matters by Deloitte & Touche LLP of Berkshire Hathaway, the ones I mentioned, goodwill and indefinite life intangible assets and unpaid losses and loss adjustment expenses, retroactive reinsurance contracts. Why do you believe those two critical audit matters provide decision useful information to investors?
Okay, well, when I go through the 10K or the annual report, and I'm looking for information and trying to pad out my knowledge of the company. Two reasons I'm looking at the CAMs. One, if I am aware of some situation within the company that would seem to have some critical audit potential, I'd like to see that the auditors thought the same thing. And all three of these hit that mark, okay? If you're looking at an insurance company, you know that one of the biggest rubbery numbers on the balance sheet is going to be the reserve for unpaid losses and adjustments to prior unpaid loss liabilities. Two, you know that goodwill is going to be a touchy thing. Berkshire Hathaway had both of those. Obviously, they're in the insurance business. So I was happy to see that the auditors thought the same as me, that these are touchy situations for the balance sheet and entail audit risk. That's the first reason why I like to look at CAMs. And I think this is the same for other investors who happen to actually read the financial statements, and they do exist. There are such investors. Maybe they only read sections of the financial statements, but they do. The other reason, as I was starting to say, is that you try to find new information. Like I said, you want to pad out your knowledge about the company. You want to find out what risks there are inside the company that you might not have thought of or you might not have been aware of. And you've got auditors on the inside of the company who are somewhat exposed to the same kind of risks that the investors are. They're exposed to the risk that there's a misstatement in the financials, just as investors are. So they should be looking out for their own protection and relaying that to the investors who they're working for. So those are the two reasons I look at them. And like I said, on Berkshire Hathaway, you know that that's like one of the biggest numbers on the balance sheet. And you also know that it's a very flexible number, and it has all kinds of possible adjustments that could occur to it, whether benign or malevolent. Not saying anything about the quality of those numbers on any of the balance sheets we're talking about here. So yeah, I was happy to see that, and I thought that Deloitte did a fair job of presenting it. And what's interesting is it mapped well to the critical accounting policies and estimates that Berkshire Hathaway presented in far greater detail than Deloitte presented as far as what they did to get happy with the statement of the balances. Same thing for the goodwill write-down. Excuse me, not the goodwill write-down, the goodwill testing related to precision cast parts. If you follow Berkshire Hathaway, you know that those are two sensitive areas. You want to see that the auditors thought so too. I think that is pretty much what you're asking for. If I could go on a little bit more.
So Jack, follow-up question. Do you have any views as to how the two winning critical audit matters of Berkshire Hathaway could be further improved?
Yeah, I think that Deloitte, although they did a good job of, avoiding complete boilerplate, they could have added a little bit more flesh to the bones. They did say that they tested key assumptions, but which ones? Didn't say. They tested the key assumptions. How? They did give a good outline of their strategy in auditing the balance, but a little bit more detail would have been more compelling or more comforting to the investor. Remember, this is also kind of a under the table check on the quality of the audit. So anybody that's just putting out boilerplate or skipping on details is not giving you a very good feeling for how well they did the work. They didn't, and the outcome is presumed that everything is okay because we didn't do anything other than give an unqualified opinion. But if you say that in the overall opinion, why not say it on the one critical audit matter as well?
So Jack,
before we could have seen more assurance and more discussion of how the work was done.
So Jack, before we move to the third winner, I thought I'd first give an opportunity for IHE members who, particularly those who voted for the two CAMs at Berkshire Hathaway, to express any views they have on the first two winners. Anyone?
The good news is I voted for all three that ended up winning, so I feel good about that. No, I actually looked at, when we looked at them, I looked at companies that I think were responsive to people would recognize the companies. I did look, I must admit, Jack, I know who you are, and so I looked at who recommended it, and I thought of that. I did agree exactly with what Jack said relative to if I were looking at the companies, what are the major issues that I would think have significant estimates that have judgment applied to them. I like the way they were worded. Jack is better than I in terms of how they might be improved. And so I thought they were representative that would be useful for others to look at how, a major judgment area, well done by Deloitte and the company, a company that's a recognized great company. So, because some of them were, like you mentioned a lot from British Petroleum or BP, and I'm thinking, well, that's not as representative a company as I would like. I'd like to have a company as representative that we sort of recognize well here locally. And so anyway, that was some of my thoughts. But I must admit the fact that, Jack, you recommended it made a difference to me too.
Well, thank you, Ken.
As indicated, the recipient of the third highest IHE votes for the most decision useful key or critical audit matter for 2023 was the raw material inventory write-downs critical audit matter by Ernst & Young LLP at Moderna. So Jack, explain to us why you believe this critical audit matter provides decision useful information to investors.
I will. Could I say a couple more things about Berkshire Hathaway?
Absolutely.
Maybe you're going to come back to this, but I just wanted to make sure I got it out there. It's not perfect. I mean, there were only two that I recall, those two critical audit matters. That's it. Berkshire, and that's only a fraction of the width and breadth of a Berkshire Hathaway. I'm sure there's a lot more there that would have entailed some sleepless nights, maybe. But they weren't there. So remember I said that there's two reasons why you look for CAMs, or at least why I do. One, to buttress my knowledge of what I think is a risk or a dangerous part or risky part of the financial statements in the company. And two, to get new information. There wasn't anything uncovered by those CAMs. I'm sorry. So I just wanted to get that out in case we ran out of time.
Could I add that? Could I add? I think one of the things that I know when I go through audits is for whatever reason, there seems to be reluctance by the auditors to go. I mean, I looked at the average. The average is 1 to 2 number of CAMs. I think there's a lot of ones, some twos. So I think what you're saying, Jack, which I don't quite. It would be good for us to sort of delve more into it as to. There seems a reluctance by the auditors to go certainly beyond 2, except unusual circumstance. And I actually pushed, well, I'm not going to say the name, but one, and I had an argument thinking there ought to be another one, and they sort of pushed back against me. So I think it might be useful to explore why there are not more CAMs than generally 1 or 2. And I think that's a little bit what you were going with, Jack, as well.
And
Yeah.
just for the
I
record,
agree. And I think one thing that I have consistently been puzzled by, and this is not the case with Berkshire Hathaway, it's not a good example of this. I find that there's a lot more disclosure of critical accounting policies and critical estimates by management in the MD&A than there are critical audit matters. Why don't the two map to each other? Especially if auditors are concerned about management's assertions and they're auditing management's assertions basically in the whole set of financial statements. Why isn't there more correlation between management's selection of critical accounting policies and CAMs?
just for the
The reason I
record,
come up with is because, yeah.
Sorry, just to clarify, I just wanted to make sure for the record that the IAG, the CAMs that were considered were nominated by the public, and the IAG selected them. The PCAOB staff and the board did not have any role in selecting or nominating these CAMs, so I just wanted to make sure that it's clear.
and just for the record, Berkshire Hathaway had 3 CAMs.
Okay, thanks.
So
I think
Jack,
the third one,
tell us,
income tax.
Jack, tell us about Moderna, why you selected
Yeah,
their CAM.
back to Moderna. Okay, thanks. Well, Moderna was very much in the same first camp that I described. You know, you expect that there's something, it's a risk in the balance sheet and, or the income statement, and they complied with your expectations. Moderna had a lot of their business go away after COVID went away, and you expected that the balance sheet was not going to have all of the usable inventory that they had at the beginning of the year as effectively as they would have if COVID hadn't been controlled. So, you know, you knew that a big chunk of their business was going to go away, and the auditors did a fine job, I thought, of describing it. First of all, they selected it as a critical matter, which you expected. And they did a good job of explaining how they tested it and why it was difficult to test, because they were in uncharted territory. Nobody had ever had a vaccine like that before and then had it suddenly become useless. Not a lot of prior experience for the company because the company was pretty new too. So I thought that they handled it very well and it was informative. But again, what I was disappointed in, there wasn't anything new that I learned about Moderna as far as a risk area from the CAMs. And they did not have, neither company had a whole lot in their critical accounting policies and estimates. So I guess my ramble there about not mapping well in most places of other companies to critical accounting policies doesn't apply here. They mapped pretty well from the CAMs to the critical accounting policies, but it just wasn't very much of either one. And now, the one thing that Moderna, where I feel like I think that what they did on the CAM that I nominated was fine. But the CAM that wasn't there is the one that bothered me, okay? Like I said, you go in there with an expectation that there's going to be something that adds to your knowledge or something that's supposed to be there, okay? So, yeah, the write-down was there. But what about R&D? Because at Moderna, you know, they just pretty much spend everything on R&D. How do I know that what's being represented as R&D is really top quality or top-notch R&D or has actually been classified properly? Something like 73, 74% of revenues in 2023 were R&D at Moderna. It seems to me that that's a pretty big audit matter, but there was no CAM about it. And maybe I shouldn't be so anticipatory that there would be one there, but it seems to me that that's a pretty big income statement number, a big classification risk, and the auditors didn't think so. So anyway, that's Moderna.
Any comments from IAG members about the Moderna? Cam?
Not specifically
anything
about
else? Go
Moderna.
right ahead.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I was amazed at the CAC response. I belittled CAMS historically, and I apologize for that. But I think Ken points his finger to an interesting question, as does Jack.
Can't hear it. Can't hear you, Sandy. I think maybe you need to be close.
So I'll be closer, better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, yeah, I think both Jack and Ken pointed to something interesting to me. I'm an investment banker, so risk exposure in every document we ever had was significant. I mean, the risk exposure, I think the SEC estimates that it's on average 19 pages in the typical 10K, and they're trying to get it down because it's just too voluminous. It's interesting to me that and I don't know how they do it, but how do you select? I imagine Berkshire Hathaway probably has more than 19 pages of risk exposure in their filings. How do they pick out 2? I mean, I've experienced as an audit committee chair that, you know, the auditor picks out one, okay, it's accounts receivable this year. Are we really worried about your accounts receivable? And I say, well, we worried about it last year too. Why is it this year? And well, it's because as they ranked all of the risks that we had, they said, yeah, we think this one stands out for us this year. And I often wondered, how did they determine it? It's just visceral, or is there something that accounting firms are using to make this determination?
Great question.
Jack, can I ask a question? I had to think about this, you know, because as you know, we expense R&D. Yeah, we all know that generally, although sometimes it gets capitalized for software. But what would you know, actually for me to learn, how would you point a risk factor for R&D? Because it's obviously, since it's expense, it's not in your balance sheet. So is the risk that it's not productive? You're not going to get any value for it, but how do you, since you brought that up, what are you recommending there, just so I can think about it?
Okay. Well, think about FASB a little bit. You know, the guidance on FASB's statement number 2, I don't know what it's called now under the ASC, is very non-prescriptive. This says all R&D experience, all R&D expense must be, all R&D efforts must be expensed, unless there's the software exceptions or the acquired exceptions. But how do you classify something as R&D? You know, is it, if you have something, it's the classifications within the income statement that worry me. Like how much of it could be G&A, and we don't know it. If you put it into R&D, everybody thinks it's good. But if a company is misclassifying some things that really might be considered G&A, suppose they're making a process that's going to speed up collections of R&D, or maybe there's some design or workflow study that they've paid for to, you know, increase the speed with which they collect cash. And, you know, is that G&A or is that R&D? Because it's really doing something internally to improve the company's products and processes. I just worry that sometimes not everything that goes into R&D is, you know, really lab work or engineering work. And I don't think, probably the example I just gave wasn't the best example, but I think you get the idea. There's a pass on everything that goes into R&D. You know, you hear companies in the tech sector being judged by their spend of R&D compared to revenues as to whether or not they're investing in it, because we really can't find it on a balance sheet, right? So I think there's a temptation or a risk that they might stretch the boundaries of what goes into R&D because it makes a good optic. But I think the problem really comes from, the definition of R&D in GAAP. And it hasn't been refined enough or hasn't been looked at in terms of maybe some of it is capitalizable. I think that's not in this purview here. But I think the classifications of R&D expenses would be an audit under the existing audit standards and GAAP.
This is a great discussion, but we unfortunately are running out of time. So just one more minute, and then we need to end.
Well,
could I maybe contribute, Saba? Look, I think Jeff gave an absolutely super summary of both the discussions and the sort of meeting of minds of what might happen next, and indeed how the three best were awarded. I would point out, though, if I think I'm right, Jeff, in saying that of the 26 or whatever it was, there would have been 15 or 16 of them that specifically related to, I think, European companies, where there were fossil fuel companies and there was some issue to do with the sustainability of their assets and their asset retirement obligations and all the rest of it. And those were the nominations that were coming from investors. And I think that might reflect, first of all, the deep concern of investors about that issue and this seemingly anomalous thing that European companies that are dual listed are declaring a key audit matter in Europe, and then they're saying it's not a key audit matter in the United States. And that feels completely anomalous. And indeed, from the really excellent discussion that we had about this earlier in the cycle, I think not the intention of the CAMs in the United States, that they would look much more like the ones in Europe with more CAMs and more things. But I think just making that point of sort of 2/3 of them were about these fossil fuel companies and the failure to talk about those risks. However, I would absolutely defer to Jack in terms of who won gold medals for having spotted the right things. But I suspect amongst investors, that would be the thing they'd really like to have people take a look at.
David, if I could just maybe take 30 seconds here to ask you a question, or anybody. You just triggered a thought. How long ago did the KAMs start to appear versus AMs? Is there a big difference?
I don't think there was a big difference, Jack, but I wouldn't put my hand on the Bible to that. I'm not certain.
Okay. I was just wondering if there was a longer learning curve on the KAMs versus the
I don't know. I think there is just this funny anomaly that we're finding difficult to explain, and I even wonder just if to my earlier conversation, to my earlier sort of questions, Barbara, just if there was a sort of feeling that the PCAOB were doing something on this might be something where people could be persuaded that they wanted to move, and I think that would be good for financial markets and reflect well on the PCAOB and their response to investors.
David, I'm so sorry, but we really have to end.
Saba, can I just say quickly that the IHE plans to develop and vote on the public issuance of a final report before year end that provides all the details that Paul talked about the 26 key or critical audit matters that were nominated, and also more information about the 3 winning critical audit matters, including the discussions that we had today. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Jack, and everyone else for the lively discussion. Thank you to our guest speakers for contributing to today's meeting. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.